Since time immemorial, the Toronto area was inhabited by the Seneca. They fled the area in 1687 because the French were attacking nearby Seneca villages. At this time, Toronto was occupied by the Mohawks and the Huron-Wendat, who shared a similar culture and both spoke the Iroquoian language. Between 1634 and 1635, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation arrived in Toronto and by 1700 were the sole inhabitants after they forcibly removed the Iroquois and the Hurons. In 1787, the Government of Canada attempted to purchase Toronto's land from the Mississaugas in order to continue its acquisition of southern Ontario. When this document was re-examined, however, there was no indication as to what land had actually been purchased, and the signatures of the chiefs who had allegedly agreed to the purchase were cut out from another piece of paper. By 1788, the Mississaugas were actively resisting the government's presence on their territory, so by 1805, a new purchase was negotiated. This was the Toronto Purchase, or as it is sometimes referred to, Treaty 13. The purchase gave the government all of Toronto in exchange for a low price and the ability to retain exclusive traditional fishing rights on Etobicoke Creek. This treaty was a clear demonstration of the beginning of the Long Assault, and the following dispersal and colonizing attitudes indicated that the situation would only worsen before it would improve. By the 1830s, outside influence manipulated the Mississaugas' traditional culture as they were so largely outnumbered by European settlers that aspects such as spirituality and clothing were altered. A decade later, the situation for the Mississaugas in Toronto was so dire that head chief Joseph Sawyer felt it necessary to move his people off of their traditional lands.
Preceding the 1805 signing of Treaty 13 came an era of industrialization and development. Post-World War II would promise greener, undisturbed pastures deemed favorable for development to the new settlers that were of European descent. In 1955, the British Medical Journal would tell of a home-away-from-home environment that could be found just across the shores of the Atlantic, highlighting the promise in agriculture and industry combined with all the sins of Europe that could be found from the streetcar to the many shopping outlets that Toronto had to offer. Fast forward to modern-day Toronto, and we can understand how the further displacement of Indigenous culture is affected by the prolonged long assaults imposed by the presence of the European culture. As of 2016, approximately 2.7 million people resided in the city of Toronto. Approximately 23,000 individuals identify as being Aboriginal in the city of Toronto, and of this population, 8,000 people as actually having Indian status. The lack of cultural Indigenous representation in Toronto is a result of the increasing cultural mosaic that is woven into the multicultural fabric that Toronto has built its reputation from. The city of Toronto is home to more than 200 ethnic groups that have decided to call Toronto its home. The Urban Aboriginal People Study in 2010 conducted interviews with over 2,600 self-identifying Indigenous people living in the city of Toronto. Of these individuals, 90% report that they are proud of their Indigenous heritage, while only 65% report to be content with their Canadian heritage. Other notable statistics in the report reveal that 2/3 of the Indigenous population living in Toronto report having been impacted by residential schools. However, Indigenous peoples residing in Toronto claim to have the most adequate cultural activities in comparison to other major Canadian cities.
While Indigenous peoples in Toronto have been oppressed since European arrival, they are a critical aspect of Toronto's society, and their issues must be regarded as an issue for all Torontonians.